We've been introduced to the idea of melody as a series of pitches or pitch classes. So I'm going to start out this episode by playing the same melody for you twice. So obviously it would be difficult for me to convince anyone that that was the same melody. Something else is going on, something more than just a series of pitches or pitch classes. We're interested in the duration and timing of those particular pitches or pitch classes, and that makes all the difference between creating a melody that sounds like something we might not have heard before and something that sounds like "O Canada," the national anthem. So usually what we talk about in this context is something called musical rhythm. But what exactly is rhythm? That's going to be the subject of this episode. And I've already given a clue as to how we're going to approach that idea. I'm going to be interested in the concepts of duration on the one hand and timing on the other, how they are distinct from one another and how they fit together in a musical context. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is how we perceive time and how we work with time as musicians. The first thing I want to talk about is duration, because that is obviously something that I could use to distinguish between the two versions of that sequence of pitches that I just played. I could measure using a clock or stopwatch or something like that exactly how long each of the musical notes were that I played in the O Canada version of that melodic contour and the other version that I came up with of the identical melodic contour. I could say, well, in this case I used a note that was 2 seconds long followed by one that was 1 second long, or fractions thereof. In the other case it was the other way around, so on and so forth. I could measure duration chronometrically. That means using some kind of timekeeping device. However, that's not usually how musicians proceed. Typically, musicians work from a kind of inner sense of how units of time relate to each other, whatever the size of those units happen to be. Now, those units themselves can, of course, be measured chronometrically, and that is something that we are going to return to toward the end of this episode when we consider a very popular chronometric device known as the metronome. It's another type of chronometer that's closely related to the clock, kind of a variation of the clock. However, what we're going to be interested in to start out with is the notion of relationships of units of duration. So for example, we can use the clock as an analogy. I can imagine, for example, snapping my fingers to a particular pace, and I could make a recording of that and see how long the units of duration were. They might not have been especially precise because I'm not very good at snapping my fingers that precisely, but there'd be some kind of regularity that's there. Now, I could snap my fingers exactly at the rate of seconds subdividing a minute, or I could snap them at some other rate. But what would matter to me is the fact that there is some consistency in that rate at which I'm snapping my fingers. So whenever we have a sense of consistent units of duration, we refer to that as a musical pulse. And pulse is what becomes the framework for our values of duration. So for example, I could say that if I'm tapping something on this piano surface, with my other hand, I could tap something else. I have no idea how long those units actually are if I measure them chronometrically. But what I do know is that I've got 2 of one unit for every single unit of the other. There's a sense of relationship between these pulse streams. So this becomes the basis for a whole series of time relationships that measure duration not chronometrically, but purely in terms of their relationship to each other. Therefore, what I can start to come up with is a way to represent those relative values of duration to one another. So the first thing that we're going to be learning about are these ways of representing relative values of duration. So what I've drawn on the board behind me are ways in which we can start to represent relationships of duration in the graphic framework that we've been already introduced to. And in fact, one of these symbols will be familiar to us because I've been using that to notate sequences of pitches in my examples in the previous episode. That actually has a particular name. It's called a whole note. So a whole note of what? Well, we don't precisely know because it's not something that's defined by a particular unit of chronometric time. I can't say a whole note occupies 2 seconds or 10 minutes. It is simply a foundation for establishing a whole stream of durational relationships. And that's what's being represented by these other symbols. Now, normally I'm drawing these out in a class, but I'm very aware of the fact that probably as part of your education you're having to watch a lot of videos, and I want to decrease your screen time. But one of the things that you would notice as I was drawing these out is that each one took a little bit more time to draw. And there's a reason for that. If you look at this series of symbols, you can start to notice things in a sort of abstract graphic way. To start out with, I have something that's kind of an empty space that's enclosed by a sort of oval, and then I have something that's a little bit smaller, but it's still the same idea, the empty space, but I had to add this thing that we call a stem to it. So that's two things I had to draw. Here I had to draw three. I had to have that oval, I had to put in the stem, and then I had to fill in the oval, so that was three things that I had to draw. Here I had to draw four. All of the other steps I'd done before, plus adding this little thing here that we call a flag. In this case, I added a second flag, a third, and a fourth. So each of these levels is preserving some feature from the previous level, but it requires an extra step to make it happen. And what that means is that if you look at these things in isolation, if you saw something like this, and you saw something like this, graphically they're so distinct from each other, they're so far apart, that it gives you a visceral sense of what they might represent in terms of duration, that they're not close to one another. Whereas if I had something like this and that, visually they already look that much more similar to each other. So there's a way in which, at least when we're notating relative values of sound, that we give our viewers of this material an immediate kind of subconscious sense of how they might relate to each other. It's a way of telegraphing information as rapidly as possible so that musicians can easily read these temporal relationships. Now, these things actually do have names, of course. I already started us out with the idea of the whole note. And even though it is graphically twice as complicated, it's actually half the value of a whole note. This is something called a half note. So in terms of relative units of duration, 2 halves will equal a whole. Whatever pitch I assign to that, I would need 2 pitches if they were assigned this note value to add up to the same unit of time. This is going to continue that pattern. We call it a quarter note. And 2 of these will add up to one of those. 2 quarters will equal a half, but of course 4 quarters equal a whole. So you can quickly see how this terminology keeps relating back to the idea of a whole unit of time. That's the foundation for this. Going a step further, I can have an 8th note. This is where I've added my first flag. And below that, I have the 16th note. I've added a second flag, 32nd note, there, a third flag, 64th, fourth flag, and I have seen 128th notes as well. One thing I would mention, it's very inexpertly drawn obviously, but when we're adding these flags on, each subsequent flag is supposed to be slightly smaller and the stem is supposed to extend straightly longer. So this portion we refer to as the note head, so it's either filled in or it isn't. We have stems being applied here and then flags from the 8th note down. And as you can guess, it will take 64 of these to add up to one of those, or 32 of these to add up to one of those, and so on. So all of these things relate to each other in that fashion. Associated with that, of course, is the idea of musical silence. We want to be able to have durational values for that too. Famous example. So how long is the pause supposed to be between the two little statements of this melodic idea, da 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 da? Silence is as crucial a component of musical experience as sound itself, especially a composer like Beethoven, who's full of dramatic silences. We want to be able to have a similar way, therefore, to represent relative values of rest. And so what I'm showing over here are the corresponding symbols for that. And I didn't draw this right next to that because I wanted you to see where you would normally encounter it on a musical staff. And that is both the rest symbols for the whole rest and the half rest intrude on this second space from the top, the whole rest hanging from that staff line that's above it, and the half rest resting on the middle staff line. Okay, these symbols can be used in slightly different ways depending on a context that we'll be looking at in the next episode, where we're talking about things called measures, but we'll save that for the next episode. But yes, I can have a whole rest, I can have a half rest, quarter note rest, and then one thing that starts to make a little bit more sense visually perhaps, because there's a lot of inconsistency here. We don't have the nice gradual graphic growth of design features that we have over there. These are similar to each other. This is completely different. Here we started in a new direction, but it's kind of like we have reverse flags matching up for the 8th rest, 16th rest, 32nd rest, and 64th rest. So now what we have is a system in place that we could use to represent these particular values of duration. So the first thing that I want to do is play a simple passage for you and consider ways in which we could notate it using these relative values of duration. So I've written a very basic kind of composition on the board. Really all I'm doing is using pitches to represent particular pulse streams. I have a half note pulse in the middle that's kind of binding the two together. On top, quarter note pulse at the very bottom, whole note pulse. So here's what it sounds like. I'll start with the bottom pulse stream and then gradually add in the other layers. Okay, you get the idea. What I want to convey is how these things can work with each other in concert. That 2 of these clearly add up to one of those, 4 of these add up to one of those, and everything is integrated in that fashion. The crucial thing is that this was a notation choice that I made. Maybe I decided that the top pulse stream was one that I was going to notate in quarter notes, and then I adjusted all the other note values in relation to that. Or maybe I started with the lowest pulse stream and built it up from there. If I decided to change that note value, I could do so long as I made adjustments to all of the others at the same time. So if I decided, for example, that actually I wanted to notate that slowest pulse stream using half notes, well then the adjustment I would have to make would be here. To create a pulse stream that would be precisely subdividing this one in units of 2. So I need to use quarter notes there, which would mean that I'd have to use eighth notes there. And then likewise, if I wanted to notate this using quarter notes for whatever reasons, then if I did that, I would of course have to adjust this to eighth note values and these to sixteenths. So in this sense, none of these is more right than any of the others. Each of them is right in their own way because each of them is preserving this very particular hierarchical relationship between the pulse streams, and it's being represented in a way that makes clear sense to me through the consistency of the notational values that I'm working with. Now, one thing that I'm not showing here is stepping outside of just pulse streams themselves. I might want to do things like change up some of these rhythms. So I could decide that in a similar fashion, I could do things like the following. So I'm mixing together different values of duration in the same level of the texture, and that's typically how we will encounter notation of duration in music. There will be a variety of information that's kind of brought together into one stream, but that's starting to raise some other issues because it might be relatively easy for me to read these pulse streams by themselves. When I start seeing a bunch of note values like that, I feel a need for some kind of framework to stand behind them so that I know what I am to read them in relation to. Rather than just individual units of duration being thrown up, they grow out of relationships to other pulse streams. So how can I do that? How can I notate in a way that will help musicians employ a sense of a feeling of consistency when reading diversity like that? So one of the basic questions I could have asked right at the start was, well, how do I know, for example, which of these corresponds with which of these? I've tried to represent that visually as best I could, but drawn by hand it maybe looks a little bit clumsy, but that is just the visual aspect. What about the sound aspect? I'm going to repeat the idea of quarter notes. And what I want to achieve is something that will sound like this. And not like this, where there's a slight lag before this part comes in. Let's imagine that I were going to assign chronometric values to the quarter note and say, actually, it's precisely a second long. That would mean that these are kind of like two clocks that are ticking together, and what I would like is for those ticks to be lined up with each other and not to have my clock started at different times. So what creates that alignment? Well, that of course is musical timing, and the way we talk about timing in music theory is in association with something called the beat. What the beat is a way of providing alignment for pulse streams to ensure that there's kind of a background framework for these relative values of duration that can line up with each other. And typically what we do is we take one particular pulse stream, highlight that as the foundation for a series of time points running through the music. So for example, I could say that in my original notation, I'll stick with something basic like this. And let's imagine that these are all eighth notes. I don't want to erase all of the little second flags, or we can just ignore them completely. I could say that as a framework for all of the kind of durational activity that's taking place, I want to establish a half-note pulse stream as the one that's going to control everything, which means that I have a sense that at the onset of each unit of duration, that is where I will understand the beat to be. So what I'm trying to indicate is that the beat is not the same thing as duration itself any more than the ticking of a clock that happens to be measuring seconds is a second long itself. The time points are what initiate each second, and they don't have the duration of a second. We're just saying that there's a way in which those units of time, the seconds, are going to be privileged as the framework for judging other things. We'll use them as the unit of measurement. So that is typically what a beat is doing. It is highlighting the concept of a particular pulse stream that will then be used as a framework for all of this other activity. And that's why if we have something like that in place, which can be established by the snapping of a band leader's fingers, or it could be in some sense composed into how the music is written. It might be given in a very clear fashion in an accompaniment or something like that. What that creates is a kind of framework for all of these relative values of duration to play around inside of. The crucial thing here is that even if I can measure each of the note values that I played in my original rendition of O Canada and calculate all of those intervals according to a stopwatch or something like that and show exactly how long they are, I don't hear that kind of activity just as a series of durations. What I hear is durations in relation to an underlying framework that is defined by a value of pulse marked by the beat. So this is how I understand musical rhythm. It's not just a series of durations of sounds and silences. It's hearing those durations of sounds and silences in relation to a beat framework of some type. Now, later on in this series, we will look at ways in which we can build larger units than just the beat itself. But the first thing that we want to do is consider the impact of the beat on this perception of a framework of some kind that we also want to capture in music notation. So I've notated a rhythmic sequence on the board, but it's very difficult for me to actually read it as rhythm. I have a whole series of values of duration, relative values of duration, of course. I've got a couple of 16th, a couple of 8ths, quarter note, 8th, 8th, 16th, 8th, 16th, quarter, 8th, and quarter note. Those are all very precisely notated, but I would still find it very difficult to read that sequence. Now, I could establish a framework of some type. I could say, for example, I want to read this rhythm in terms of a quarter note pulse. So the idea is that a beat will be used to frame a quarter note pulse throughout. So I could imagine doing something like this, and what I'm tapping is the onset of each quarter note, and then I should read this in relation to that. Well, I know that for each of these things, that 4 of these would add up to one of those, 2 of these would add up to one of those would add up to one of those, but I'm not always necessarily getting that information. I've got just 2 of these, not 4, and then I run into one of these. That's nice, but then I have that followed by a quarter note, which doesn't seem to fit in terribly well. I'd be really stuck if I were asked on the spot to just read that rhythm at sight the way it's presented to me here. Now, one of the things we want to keep in mind is that music notation is successful to the extent that it looks the way it should feel. So one of the guiding principles in notation like this is to look for ways to capture a musical feeling that we want to convey in visual terms. Now, what we need to do is introduce a new notational device. I've given all of these durational values individually. They're all absolutely accurate and correct. However, I don't have any sense of grouping, how they might be understood as part of something larger like a quarter note pulse. So one thing that we can do for any of the values of duration from an 8th note on down through 128 That is to say, those note values that have flags, is we can imagine tying those flags together to show grouping. I'll show you what I mean. Eighth notes, for example, I can write individually like so, or I can imagine that flag flipping around and tying those things together in this way. Those are two flags tied taut together to indicate how they subdivide a larger unit of time, a quarter note, for example. Now, rather than actually physically tying flags together, what we do is just draw a straight line across there, and we call that a beam. I can do the same thing with multiple flags. For example, if I had two 16th notes and I wanted to show how together they added up to, for example, an 8th note, I can indicate that by giving two beams, as though the two flags were being tied together. So this is showing that these things add up to a quarter note. This is showing that these things add up to an 8th. Well, can I take something like this and tie them together in such a way that they could also add up to a quarter note? I certainly could, by running those beams across all of these note values. Now that begs the question, can I only beam together notes of the same kind of value? So obviously I can't apply beams to things like quarter notes or half notes or whole notes. Later on we'll discover that there are other kinds of things, brackets that we can use to kind of indicate groupings of a special sort. We call them tuplets. But right now we're just interested in the notion of beaming, and we seem to be stuck at just beaming together the same kinds of note values. Well, actually, you can mix things up because, for example, if all of this is adding up to a quarter note, well, it would also be the case that an 8th and 2 16ths could add up to a quarter note. And that might be something I would want to do in some musical context where, for example, I was coming across this rhythm and wanting to hear it in terms of this underlying quarter note pulse. So what I can do is beam together notes of different values and what we say is that the number of beams touching a stem indicates its value. So obviously there's only one beam touching this stem, that's going to be an 8th note. This beam isn't connected that way because that's an 8th note. I don't want to change the value of that, but this has a beam touching it, that has a beam touching it. We are going to know that both of those are 16th notes. But does that mean then that once again I can only beam together immediately notes of the same value? Certainly not. I could come up with a similar circumstance where, let's say, I wanted 2 8ths and a 16th, but not necessarily in that order. This would also add up to a quarter note. How could I beam those together to show that? Well, I would do it this way. I haven't shown this quite clearly enough. I have partial beams. Now here's the important thing. Partial beams follow the same principle. The number of beams touching the stem indicates what the value of that note is. So 2 beams touching this stem means that note's a 16th. Same thing over here. I have to make sure it touches. What you have to make sure of as well visually is that we have a sense of enclosure. So partial beams are never sticking outside, okay? Because you might say, well, I've got 2 beams touching that stem, therefore clearly that's a 16th. They have to be swung inside the overarching beam framework, like that, okay? And then one more point, it could be the case that sometime you might want to beam together large numbers of note values. So for example, something like this. So I'm going to call all of these 16th notes. That's a value of a quarter, that's a value of a quarter. I'm beaming them all together because maybe there's some context in which I want the beat to identify a half note pulse. I want to beam all those things together. You could have too much of a good thing. Everything is beamed together, but there's so much stuff being beamed together that rather than it aiding my eye and my sense of grouping, my tendency is to start to want to subdivide and count. How many actually are there? What's taking place? If you encounter a circumstance like this, you do have an occasion to make a break in the beaming so that that desire of the mind to calculate larger groups of notes is satisfied in the most efficient way possible. I look at that and instantly my eye can grasp 4 twice. I can almost immediately see that that is a group of 8, and I will know how to read the rhythm accordingly. It won't help if I do something like this, which just kind of looks strange to my eye. I don't have an immediate sense of subdivision. So this is, again, applying the principle of the number of beams that touch the stem indicate the associated note value. So even if there's a gap there, on either side of that gap I have 2 beams touching that note stem, 2 beams touching that note stem. Both of these are 16ths as well. Or it could be the case that actually what I'm looking for is something that's going to add up to a quarter note pulse. I can subdivide 30 seconds in that way. This just comes down to some basic cognitive characteristics that most of us have. Most of us can perceive up to around 7 objects as a group, as a whole, and beyond 7 we tend to need, most of us, to start subdividing into smaller units to build up our picture of the larger number of units. So once you go above 7, this is where you have to start considering these other kinds of graphic ideas to just kind of parse things for just normal cognitive functioning to make it easy to read. Now, that whole idea of making things easy to read, how can I apply that to this? Because again, if I want to set up a framework for experiencing this rhythm, let's say a quarter note pulse being marked by the beat, I'm going to need some assistance in that to see if there's some way that I can, for example, group things, maybe using beams, that will make it possible for me to read that as always taking place in the context of this recurrent sense of a quarter note pulse. Now, there's one other thing I have to start to introduce, and that is the idea that I'm not restricted to just working with these individual note values themselves. I can actually create intermediate values of duration by using devices of various sorts. I can talk about things called ties, I can talk about things called augmentation dots, and I can talk about things called tuplets. The first thing I'm going to be interested in is the idea of the tie. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, one way in which I can come up with an intermediate value of duration, for example, between, let's say, a half note and a whole note, so something that's more than a half note but less than a whole note. How could I do that? Well, I could add something on to a half note by placing a tie like that. What that means is that I do not re-articulate that pitch, whatever it happens to be. I'm just hanging on to it a bit longer. So this is something that is clearly not as big as a whole note. It's 1/4 too short. It's obviously visually larger than just a half note, so it's an intermediate value of duration. So ties work when you have note heads that are occupying the same line or space on a staff. Something like this would not be a tie, because to play that second value, necessarily I would have to articulate it. That is a different pitch. So ties only work when clearly you are working with the same pitch, all right? The other thing that you should know about ties is that they're tremendously flexible. They're wonderful graphic devices because I can tie together notes of radically different value. If I wanted to, for example, I could make an intermediate value of duration that's only slightly larger than a half note. I can use ties to connect any of these things together. And in fact, I could even do something like this. And you might say, well, why would you ever want to do that? Because that's not an intermediate value of duration. That is a half note. Why would you want to make a half note more complicated and turn it into 2/4? I know that 2/4 add up to a half note. Why do that? Well, there will be circumstances where actually it will be easier to read a subdivided value like that rather than the whole value itself. So these two ideas, the use of beaming and the use of ties, I'm going to bring together now in solving this musical problem for myself. Because as I said before, the notation is very precise. I can clearly see what each of the note values are, but I'm going to have difficulty reading them in relation to each other if I want to read them in relation to a quarter note pulse, something that will give them a kind of musical meaning, if you will. Let me show you what I mean by that. If I were to try to show where quarter note pulses would arise, I can do that relatively easy to start out with. Here, I can see that 2/16 and an eighth add up to a quarter note pulse. So what I'm going to be writing underneath is just a representation of that musical feeling that I would like to have underneath these values of duration. So the combination of the values of duration in relation to the feeling is what will produce our sense of rhythm. So I have the possibility of showing that grouping in this way. I can quite clearly see how 2/16 and an eighth together add up to a quarter note. Now, what I'm interested in is the consistency of that quarter note pulse feeling underneath, okay? I'm not looking for, oh, I can beam that together, oh, there's a quarter note, oh, I can beam those together because they make up a quarter note. I guess I can beam those together and they make up a quarter note, and then I got a quarter note and I'm stuck and then I'm somewhere else. That would not set up a form of notation that is consistently representing everything with this feeling of the beat producing a quarter note pulse, okay? What I need to start looking at is subdividing some of these representations, because I see right here that if I want to get to my next quarter note value, I have not enough there, and I have too much by the value of an eighth note there. So what I'm showing is how I want to be able to chop that note value in half, and if I do that, then I'd have 2/8 and 2/8, and I would therefore have a consistent quarter note pulse. So what I will do is literally chop that thing in half, but stitch it back together again with a tie. And this will make it possible for me to preserve exactly the same rhythm that I had before, an eighth, a quarter, and an eighth, but I can now read this in terms of a consistent underlying quarter note pulse. So if I have a pulse like that, and that's going to be marking the start of a quarter note pulse. Ba 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 ba. Okay? So now I start to see how I can read those relative values of duration in relation to this underlying feeling of a consistent quarter note pulse. What do I need to do to continue that feeling? Well, again, if I'm looking at quarter notes, just to remind myself, I've got an eighth, I'm halfway there. I've got a 16th, I'm 3/4 of the way there. I need just one more 16th, but I've got too much here. I've got a 16th too much. So again, I want to be able to cut that in half and distribute some of the value to one side and some of the value to the other side. I'll still be able to stitch it together again with a tie, but what I need to do is start out with a clearly observable subdivision. Those are going to be 2/16 that I will tie together. So this 16th plus that 16th plus that eighth note together will add up to a nice quarter note unit of pulse. So I've got a 16th left over, a 16th left over. I only need two more 16ths or an eighth. And again, I have too much. So once again, I will want to chop this thing in half. So that I will have 2/8. I will be able to stitch them together again using a tie, but now I have an eighth available to join these 16ths. And then I have an eighth left over that I can tie to this. And now it will be very easy for me to read this rhythm, because through a combination of beams and ties, I've been able to make it look like I want it to feel. So if I want to have a quarter note pulse that goes like this, da 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 da. Very easy for me to read because all the groupings precisely follow that consistent feeling of a quarter note pulse that's marked by the beat I want to work with. So here is how we can start to bring together many different graphic notation devices to make the rhythms of music come alive in a visual sense so that they are easy to read, rather than a musician coming to something and being frightened and having to calculate all of these different note lengths and stuff like that. We give them a framework in which they can follow their feelings and then subdivide within those units of pulse that they are feeling that's defined by the beat. Now, there are other ways in which I can extend note values. The tie is the most flexible one. The next thing that we actually want to consider is the second one that I mentioned, the augmentation dot. Augmentation means making something a little bit longer. I'll show you what I mean. If, for example, I have a sequence that I can already represent easily enough through the use of ties, let's imagine I was doing something like this. Okay? I've come up with an intermediate value of duration in a very precise sense, which you can see visually there. I am extending that quarter note by another note value that is half its length. Now remember, ties are very flexible. I can join together any two different values or even possibly the same value, which we found very useful in the previous example. But here I'm narrowing things down and I'm just imagining a circumstance in which this note is being extended by precisely half its value. Well, back in the day when they were introducing forms of printing, not just for text like the Gutenberg Bible and that sort of thing, but for music notation itself, if you look at these old printed scores, very old ones, They also made use of movable type. So just like Gutenberg was very good at setting up these rows, these galleys that you could put in individual pieces of type for the different letters, music publishers would do the same thing where they would take segments of musical staff and have all sorts of different note values written on them individually, right? These kinds of things. And as you can imagine, the number of pieces of type that you had to have, at least initially for printing music, was just vast. It was enormous because for every possible note value, every pitch, all of these things had to have their individual pieces of type. So one of the things they were very interested in doing was in narrowing down the number of pieces of musical type that they needed. And one thing that was quite annoying to them was having to come up with not only all these individual note values, but the use of ties and things like that. So you have to have partial ties and hope that when you printed them, they would line up. And by the way, if you look at this early printed music, you will see it really does look like staff lines that have little separations between them, and you can see these notes one after the other. So it does look a little bit like a visual jigsaw puzzle. So one thing they decided to do was to save themselves from, for example, having to have pieces of type that could cover all possible scenarios, including something like this, or, good heavens, what if the next note was this, or if the next note was this? I mean, did you have to have pieces of type for all of the possible beaming directions that could come after that? And it was something that was a little bit of a nightmare. So what they decided to do is say, well, look, rather than having the tie being used all the time, are there some occasions where we can come up with a substitute of some sort? So what they came up with was this idea. It was a vestigial dot, really a vestigial note head, that would take the place, literally, of the note value there. So it was like a small shrunken note head that said, I don't want you to replay that pitch, but I want you to hang on to it, and it will specifically mean half the value of whatever came before. So what you see in early printed music are a lot of these kinds of dots that are literally placeholders for note values. Over time, these things drift back over here until they are resting right next to the note they modify themselves. So these things we call augmentation dots. To augment something is to make it larger in some way, or longer, or more extended. So augmentation dots specifically mean extending the preceding note value by half its value. So that literally means this. It is another way of writing that, okay? Therefore, there are circumstances where you might want to use this because it's convenient. As we've just seen, there could be circumstances where something like this will be more desirable. For example, it might be the case that there's a piece of music that is written with a quarter note pulse marked by the beat, and therefore we want to be able to see that. That won't always be the case, but I'm just imagining the possibility for that. I could have a reason to still want to use the tie. In other circumstances, this might be more handy for me. So augmentation dots are a much more narrowly defined way of extending note values into intermediate values of duration. That is to say, values of duration that fall in between the quarter note, the half note, the whole note, those basic categories that we're working with. You can make them even more intermediate. For example, I can double dot something, and in which case I am understanding this as an extension of that, which was an extension of that, by a particular proportion. If the augmentation dot always means half of what came before, then this first dot represents an eighth note, and because that represents an eighth note, this represents a 16th. So this would be the same thing as that, okay? So double dotting also becomes a very popular form of notation, already beginning early in the 19th century. So this is a way in which we can start to introduce a kind of flexibility into how we notate music, moving outside of the strictly binary series of relations that we had. 2 quarters equal a half, 2 halves equal a whole, that kind of thing, from layer to layer. So here's what's available to me if I want to subdivide a whole note pulse. I can divide it in half, I can divide it into quarters, I can divide it into eighths, but there are these gaps where I might like to be able to subdivide it in other ways. For example, why wouldn't it be a musical thing to subdivide a pulse into a feeling of a grouping of 3, or of 5, or of 6, or of 7? All of those are missing here. They seem to not be available. And it would be difficult for me to imagine what kind of calculus I would have to use to come up with intermediate note values using ties and augmentation dots and things like that to subdivide something like that, or who would be able to read such a notation. We want something that makes good intuitive sense. So that is where we come to the subject matter of tuplets. Tuplet being a kind of appendage we put onto things like the sextuplet, the octuplet, the triplet, the duplet. It's a way of indicating a grouping of some kind in terms of an underlying unit of pulse. So for example, it would be nice to have a triplet in here as a way of subdividing a whole note pulse value in something that stands in between the half note and the quarter note. So the way in which tuplets generally work is by shaving off a bit of what would be understood as the conventional note value, just taking off a little bit of its temporal value and showing what that will add up to, those two things. So you start out with indicating something like a conventional note value. Someone would look at that and say, well, hang on a second, if this was supposed to be taking place in this context as a subdivision of a whole note value, that's one too many. And so you can reassure your musician that, yes, you know that that is indeed the case. Rather than hearing 2 of these in one of those units, you're asking them to hear 3 of them in there. So that number would indicate that a certain amount of time is being taken off the conventional note value, and you don't have to specify, because you can count on a musician to be able to subdivide a pulse stream of some kind. Da, dum, bum, 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 bum. That's not a difficult thing for me to do. So this is a form of reassurance. It's also a way of expressing this unit in terms of a feeling of some kind. And that's probably the most important aspect. Likewise, over here, if I wanted to subdivide again into, for example, a unit of 5, I could do something like this. Now, what I've done in both of these cases is, in temporal terms, gone from left to right. I'm taking something that was at one value, and as I move in this direction, when I apply a tuplet indication of some type, I'm shrinking that note value slightly. So I made these things slightly shorter than what a regular half note would be. I made these things slightly shorter than what a regular quarter note would be. So there's a way in which that makes good intuitive sense. What we wouldn't want to do is use something that would go against the normal intuitive reading of these note values. I'll show you what I mean. You might think that simply having the number could be enough, that would be enough to say to a musician, whatever is under here, I want 5 of these in this unit. That's true up to a certain extent, but you could also give mixed messages. For example, let's say I decided that the number 5 for the quintuplet was going to be enough, so it doesn't matter what I notate those values with? I'm just going to put in half notes, because why not? Well, for a very good reason. If my general sense is that tuplet values are shorter than their regular unit of duration, then at this point in time, these things are being read as though they were shorter than quarter notes, and that just doesn't make good sense. So there's a rule that we follow. It's the tuplet rule, which is if you take the conventional values that you're working with, you add them up as conventional values and see what they add up to. If they add up to more than twice the value of the intended unit of pulse they're subdividing, then you need to half those values. So intuitively, if I look at this, I can come along, I can see that number 5, and I will nonetheless stumble. My brain as a musician is going to pull up for a second and say, hang on, these things are supposed to be read as shorter than these. What's going on? So I'm talking out loud about the kind of computations my mind would be making, and I don't want that to happen at all. I want my mind to come into this rhythmic sequence, see that number 5, and without missing a beat, literally understand how to compress all of these note values. So if I apply the tuplet rule, I read these as conventional values, and I see that that adds up to a whole note, that adds up to a whole note, and that's more than double the value of the unit of pulse I'm supposed to be subdividing. That tells me, that's a way of measuring that I will be confusing any musician who reads that. It also tells me that what I need to do is actually cut these note values in half, and that will give an intuitively correct result. So if I fill these things in, turn them into quarter notes, like so, and then recheck. So I read them as conventional values. 2 quarters would add up to a half, 2 quarters would add up to a half, there'd be 1 quarter left over. This is less than double the value of pulse that I was trying to subdivide. So that would be A-OK. Now that is a kind of thing that a computer program, notation program, can do for you. You could incorrectly put in half notes, and you could have the programming language set up so it says, wait a second, perform this calculation. No, that's not correct, and it will automatically correct it for you, okay? But the reason why it's doing that is because we have our own calculating device in our minds as musicians, and that is something that we don't want to throw a wrench into. We want to be able to process this information as smoothly as possible. So once again, the general idea, not always, but the general idea with tuplets is that you're working with conventional note values, you're asking them to be read in a slightly unconventional way, and generally what that means is that they're going to be read shorter than their regular conventional value. And what you will also be providing is this information. In this case, I need brackets because I can't beam things. But for example, if I wanted that read in terms of an underlying whole note pulse, I don't have to apply a bracket. I can just put the number 9 on top, and the beam indicates that this whole grouping is being understood as a subdivision by 9 of that whole note pulse, what would usually be taking place in the space of 8 eighth notes. Now we're going to have 9 fitting in there. So I can identify these groupings in those 2 different ways, either applying brackets, in this case to note values where we don't have any flags that we can form beams with, or I can simply put that number above this kind of beaming. Now this takes me to one of the first exceptions that I want to talk about, and that is there is a way in which you can go crazy if you ask yourself to apply the tuplet rule and calculate everything. For example, if you have very complex melodies that have a lot of notes suddenly thrown in, you might think, okay, well, maybe I've got 12 or 13 of these notes and they're supposed to take place in the space of a single half note or something like that. And then you think, okay, well, how will I calculate the tuplet rule to know exactly what size of conventional value I should use and all the rest of it? That is almost more effort than it's worth. Maybe I would have something like this where I can see Yes, all of this is supposed to be taking place in the space of a half note, or it could be a quarter note. Who knows? But it's going to be obvious enough from the context that this is supposed to go by as quickly as it takes me to get through one of those. And therefore, you will see this kind of notation quite a lot, for example, in music by Chopin, his nocturnes. Chopin loved to hear Italian opera in Paris. It was his favorite thing to do in the evening, to go out for a walk and hear some wonderful arias being sung, and then on his way home start to imagine how he could capture that musical experience on the piano. And a lot of the great vocalists of his day, bel canto singers, would improvise all sorts of elaborate runs and things like that to make a melodic line that much more florid and interesting. And so Chopin thought, well, that would be a nice thing for me to do as well in these sort of slow evening pieces that I like to write, these nocturnes. And so you'll often see this kind of notation right from as early as nocturnes, where rather than being super fussy about a tuplet rule, you'll see this kind of indication. So 11 of these things are supposed to take place in that unit of time. And with the advent of engraved music, they also made changes to font size. So aside from the normal tuplet convention of having a number like that, they might also make the font size of the 16th note smaller. So you would recognize, oh, okay, this is a special case. They're not literally 16th notes, but they're fast notes, 11 of them that are supposed to take place in this unit of time. So that's another way in which we can apply the intuition of the tuplet, which is to say that ordinarily speaking, the note values are going to be shorter than we would anticipate them to be. Given that assumption, given this context, provide that information, that can be enough. Because otherwise, it's just essentially wasted effort of a sort, because who would read this in any other way? Now, we have one other exception to think about, and that is, it isn't always the case that the tuplet rule will be taking you towards shorter note values that are appropriate. Sometimes tuplets actually can reflect the opposite. You might be in a piece of music where, for example, you have something like this taking place, and ordinarily I might expect to see something like this happening. So things coming in groups of three. Now, if that's the norm, if that's what you would normally expect, every once in a while you might get a substitution in that context along these lines. And a musician would come to that and say, well, hang on a second, we're going to be consistent here. Should do something like that. I would be expecting three of these things. What on earth happened? Well, in this case, the idea is to extend those note values beyond the convention. In this context, that will make more sense. They need to be slightly longer because normally I'm doing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I'm going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So that is a kind of extension of these conventional note values. So there's a classic example of a duplet in this context. So keep in mind that the use of tuplets is something that is subject to a number of nuances, but tuplets are wonderful because they give us a tremendous amount of flexibility even while working with conventional notation. Now, the last thing that I need to talk about for this particular episode is at what pace this music is transpiring. Why are we going at this particular speed? We have a general term that we use, which is tempo. And tempo is something that originally was more associated with the character of a piece of music. So for example, just to give a very simple one, a lot of pieces used to be marked vivace, from Italian meaning full of life or lively. And from that you could guess that, well, I guess it would go pretty quickly. And there could be other kinds of tempo indications, again, that speak to the character of the music. There's a wonderful melody by Franz Liszt that goes like this. Now what Liszt writes is lagrimoso, which means tearfully, as though you're weeping while you play it. So those ways of indicating tempo are very nice. They do require the development of a pretty broad vocabulary. Initially, a lot of these tempo indications were given in Italian, and then over time, other countries started to contribute more of their own vocabulary as well. French music, French terms; German music, German terms. So there's a variety of terms out there that one gradually learns if you play enough music that can be used to characterize tempo. However, another method came in that could be described as more scientific, and that was introduced early in the 19th century. It was associated with developments in timekeeping devices that came out of actually revolutionary France. What I'm talking about is the development of the metronome, and that is going to be the final topic that I take up in this episode. So once upon a time, the nation of France decided to revamp its system of measurement. This was in revolutionary times, and the French revolutionary government decided to develop this thing that we've inherited as the metric system. As we know, the metric system tends to like to work with units of 10, 100, 1,000, and so on. And that is very different from how we normally measure time, where we have units of 12 and 60 and 24, that kind of thing. Well, one of the things that was attempted in revolutionary France was actually to revolutionize how time itself was going to be measured. And there was a concerted effort to develop not only metric time, but metric time pieces. So to this day, you can go to museums in Paris or in Geneva and see clock faces that have only 10 hours, and the hours themselves are subdivided into 100 minutes, that kind of thing. Now, this technology clearly didn't last, at least not in that form, but it did persist in another way. A device came out of those developments that was called the metronome. It was a chronometric device, a timekeeping device, but one that was applied to music. And in fact, composers like Ludwig van Beethoven were quite taken with the device because it made it possible for them to come up with a more precise indication for tempo. So not tempo in terms of character, but tempo in terms of how many events would take place per minute. So keep in mind that out of this revolutionary idea of coming up with metric time, what you would need to do was find new ways to subdivide a conventional minute. So rather than 60 seconds per minute, let's come up with 100 seconds per minute. But why stop there? You could have 90 seconds per minute, or 120 seconds per minute, or 150 seconds per minute. If you develop the technology, you have this flexibility of subdivision of that unit of time. And that is what a metronome is. It is a device that offers flexibility in subdividing equally units of time within a minute. Now, you've probably come across metronomes. They used to be around quite a lot as separate devices. There would sometimes be wooden ones that looked like a kind of upside down pendulum, kind of click back and forth. Mostly nowadays, of course, we get these things as apps on our phones, and they make a ticking noise like a clock, but you can set them to tick at a different rate. So here's the crucial thing. It is, of course, possible to look at a ticking clock face and hear the ticks and count up and make sure that you hear 60 of those second ticks in the space of a minute. But actually, all you really need to do is listen to that ticking noise, and you can automatically be reassured by the device that 60 of those ticks will be taking place in the space of a minute. So in a way, just listening to the ticks themselves sets up a sense of tempo. And you can imagine that if you slightly sped that up or slightly slowed it down, you would hear this change in tempo, but perhaps you could also have a measuring device that would then tell you, well, how many clicks per minute is it that I'm hearing? So what this means is that in terms of a piece of music, you can take something from the musical framework itself, for example, like the beat, and say, all right, let's imagine that I want this piece to go at such and such a pace. And that is the pacing that I associate with the beat, okay? Now, I could turn on my metronome and fiddle with the dial or whatever one does to make it line up with the tempo that I would like, and then I could check that and say, oh, I see, I'm actually wanting this to go at 120 beats per minute, let's say. So if that were the case, literally I would know that each of those beats was taking place every half a second, because if there were 60 of them, then the beats are coming at a second apart. If there are 120 of them, they're dividing those seconds in half. But there could be many other forms of subdivision. I could have a pace that I like where it turns out it's a subdivision of a minute into 80 equal parts. So the way in which I could indicate what I want to someone who would be playing my music is as follows. Since I'm using something from the musical structure itself, the idea of the beat and the unit of pulse that it marks, I want to write that down. So let's imagine that indeed I'm working with a quarter note pulse. Then I would want to tell the musician who's going to play my music how many of these they should be hearing within the space of a minute. Let's say, for example, that I did want 60 of them. I'll go with that just because for the time being it gives me something concrete to hang on to. The idea that in this instance the quarter note pulses are precisely a second long. So that is something, once again, that a person playing my music would not have to arrive at by playing 60 beats and hoping they've arrived at a minute. They could just listen to this ticking noise and go, yeah, this is how I can align my beats with those clicks. This is something that establishes a tempo for me. I know that I will achieve 60 of these over the space of a minute. If I decided actually I wanted it to go twice as fast, well, I'm retaining the same information here. I'm still imagining that I want the beat to be marking a quarter note pulse, but if I want to go twice as fast, then I double up the number over here, because what this is going to mean now is that I will hear 120 of these beat pulses, these quarter notes, within the space of a minute. Well, that's twice the number in the same unit of time, so they have to be half as short. So now this is going to be double the pace that I had before. Now, let's imagine that I was going to be applying these kinds of indications to rhythms like I have written out here. So what you'll notice is these rhythms have a relationship between the two of them, and that is I've doubled the note values that I had up here down there, okay? So let's imagine that I want these two rhythms to sound identical, and I'm going to establish a tempo up here of quarter note equals 60. So in this case, what I'm imagining is that I want a quarter note pulse to be governing all of this activity. That's why I've got the beaming set up the way I have. And so I could set my metronome at that pace, and it will give me this series of clicks that are going literally at a rate of 1 per second. And so this takes a second, this takes a second, this takes a second, therefore this takes half a second, this takes a second, this takes a second, therefore this takes a quarter of a second, and so on. Now, if I wanted to have the same result here, but I seem to have notated things a little bit differently. I have a beam, for example, over all 4 of these eighth notes, and I notice, of course, that all of the note values have doubled. Maybe in this case, I'm thinking of this rhythmic sequence in terms of a half note pulse. Well, if that's the case, to give an indication of the metronomic tempo, if I want it to sound exactly as I had notated it before, remember what we're using is a number in relation to the beat. the value of pulse that's marked or established by the beat. So in this case, that beat pulse was being heard at a rate of 60 per second. Well, now, if the same thing is supposed to be happening at the same rate of speed, so for example, if I'm feeling things like this, da, da, in this case that's marking a quarter note pulse, in this case a half note pulse, da, 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 da. That's the idea. Then the metronome indication I need to use here will be exactly the same, because this number has meaning with respect to how the music itself is organized. Okay? So in this case, there better be a total of 60 beats happening in the space of a minute. Each one should be taking a second long. I've renotated things here. The beat value is twice as long, but so are all the rhythmic values. Therefore, for it to sound exactly the same, with this new framework established, I still want to have 60 beats being heard per minute. Now let's say that I had decided instead to stick with a quarter note pulse for whatever reasons. I won't bother to subdivide my half notes. Just do this kind of thing. Well, if that's the case, and I wanted this still to sound the same as that, so it would be going at the same pace, I can't keep the same number, because this is going to have things going way too slowly, because I need to have essentially 2 quarter notes now taking up the space of a half note. So I would need to double up this number. So I'm not actually changing the tempo per se, I've actually changed the notation, and I'm modifying my metronome to reflect that. So once again, if I wanted to think of this in terms of a half note pulse, then that would be the equivalence with what I have up there. But if I still want to retain a quarter note pulse as the framework for the beat, then it would take me 120 of these to add up to 60 of these. Okay? So that's how metronomes work. As I've indicated before, it is a little bit more of a scientific approach to establishing tempo, and that said, composers are not always all that scientific in their intentions. One composer that I studied quite a lot, Bela Bartok, was very fond of being extremely precise with his metronomic indications, and yet there are a couple of pieces that he played multiple times where in the score that he notated, he gave a particular metronomic indication that he never obeyed in any of his own live performances. So when you see metronomic indications, sometimes you need to take them with a grain of salt. Not always, but sometimes. And that will even include Beethoven, who started applying metronome indications to his piano sonatas, for example, long after he had written them and when he was becoming profoundly deaf. And one has the sense that he could judge by eye how a metronome would work, because he could see this upside-down pendulum swinging back and forth. But it's quite likely that in his mind he could process the music quite a bit more quickly than we might be inclined to experience it in the real live concert world. So even a composer like Beethoven, who thought this was a nice idea for preserving some legacy of his compositional intention, might not have been all that reliable source for this kind of tempo information. We sometimes might still want to go back to those character indications, the older vocabulary for tempo.